Hi, everyone. I'm Chaya. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the first session of Mishnah in Depth Bava Batra with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot. Rabbi Helfgot is the rabbi of Congregation Nativot Shalom in Teaneck, New Jersey, and also teaches Judaic studies at SAR High School in Riverdale, New York, and serves as a scholar at its affiliated Machon Siach think tank. And this is part of our Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division, which is in memory of Rifka Rosenwein, and part of Drisha's broader Mishnah Yomit community. So thank you so much for being here. Just to run really quickly through hi, Justin, thank you for being here. Welcome. Just to run through some sort of basic housekeeping things, I'm going to share the sources in the chat, and you're welcome to follow along. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or if you're not comfortable speaking, just send that question to me, and I'm happy to pass that along to Rabbi Helfgot. But we do ask that you keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking, just to make it more seamless and easy for everybody. But if you're willing to turn on your cameras, we really love to see all those faces while we're learning to make it feel more personal and vibrant. So thank you so much for being here. And any questions, please direct to me. And thank you, Rabbi Helfgot. Over to you.
No problem. Okay, Erev Tov to everybody. I hope everybody is well, and obviously as well as we can be. We continue to be in a difficult situation as a people in Israel and throughout the world. And so we hope that the zechut of our learning, the merit of our learning, should bring positive things to our people, to Am Yisrael, to Medinat Yisrael, and to all the world. Okay, so I understand, I hope, I don't know, depending, but many people are learning throughout the world. Many people are learning the Mishnah Yomit cycle. They're studying the Mishnah in the course of the last few weeks. They finished, as I understand, Masechet Bava Metzia, and Yasher Koach to all those who finished Masechet Bava Metzia and Masechet and Masechet Baba Kama. And so you've been studying Nezikin, and as I'm sure many of you, I'm sure those who followed the introduction to Masechet Baba Kama, and I'm sure the person who taught Masechet Bava Metzia, all noted very importantly that as many of the Rishonim note, the Masechtot, at one time, what we call Baba Kama, Bava Metzia, and Baba Batra, the three Bavas, the three gates in Aramaic, at one time were one big Masechet, were all together as one big tractate called Masechet Nezikin, the Masechet related to the laws of torts and damages and kinyanim and all the things that come under the rubric of what in halachic terms we call choshen mishpat, that they were all together. And at some point they were separated into three separate Masechtot. Maybe they saw them as too unwieldy, maybe they saw them as too big to put in a book, and they divided them. And if you look at the three Bavas, they're all 10 chapters. Baba Kama is 10 chapters, Bava Metzia is 10 chapters, and Baba Batra is 10 chapters as well. And conceptually, there seems to have been at first blush, if you don't want to look at it conceptually, you just want to look at it in terms of, they just wanted to organize the material, so they made it symmetrical, 10, 10, and 10. But if you look a little bit deeper than that, it's pretty clear that the three Bavas, I want to add one more thing. If one looks at the very last Mishnah of Baba Batra, it's very clear that it's a sikum of the entire Masechet Nezikin, in the sense that the very last words of Masechet Baba Batra at the end of the 10th chapter, for those who have a Mishnah in front of them. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, chapter 10, Mishnah Chet. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, harotzeh sheyachkim, anyone who wants to become smart, ya'asok b'dinei mamonot, you should study the laws of civil law. She'ein lecha mikzoa b'Torah gadol mehem, that there's nothing, no area in Torah that is more significant than civil law. She'ein kima'ayan hanoveya, they kind of are like a flowing stream, a flowing ma'ayan, a flowing spring. And of course, throughout Jewish history, this has certainly been the case. And certainly in the last 200 years, in the yeshiva world, Nezikin, the study of the Masechtot that we associate with Nezikin, is considered kind of the most important, the top bananas, the most important thing that anyone should study. But if we go a little deeper in terms of the organizational or the differences, we'll notice that Bava Kama and Bava Metzia and Bava Batra are actually a little bit differentiated, even though the end of Bava Metzia and the beginning of Bava Batra have ksharim. They definitely have connections. Let's just start conceptually. We'll note that the Bava Kama deals with what we call nezek, what we call damages, torts, almost entirely. That's how it starts, Arba Avot Nezikin, and it talks about all the different laws of damages, including an entire parak that deals with gezela and things of that nature, of robbery. And that's the focus of Bava Kama. Bava Metzia, of course, deals with not actually stealing things or not damaging things, but the question of when you find things that are in a kind of up in the air, a jump ball, how do you determine who owns it? How do you determine who doesn't own it? It also includes the question of shomrim, the question of the four baileys, and of course, it also includes the laws of rebit, the laws of interest. So it deals with, again, questions of issues related to things that are in the Torah. Hashavat Aveda, returning a lost object, is a major theme there, and the Shomrim, which also has a major portion in the Torah. And if we look at in contrast, when we start looking at the laws that are mentioned in Bava Batra, the laws that are mentioned in Bava Batra are almost entirely not source-based, meaning Bava Kama is based on an entire long section in Parshat Mishpatim and other verses in the Torah. They have deep roots in the Bible. The Bible has an entire section dealing with questions related to what we would call questions related to damages, stealing, returning something that you stole, and exactly what the status is, what you have to pay back, what you don't have to pay back, what can be stolen, what cannot be stolen, what do you pay the damages, and all those things. And these are, so to speak, it all deals with after the fact phenomenon. Again, it's very interesting. Almost all of Bava Kama doesn't talk about what you shouldn't do. It talks about once this and this has happened, what is the tashlumin, what is the payment that has to be extracted by the Beit Din from the person that's owed. Bava Metzia is also heavily indebted to psukim. It's heavily based on psukim. It's heavily based on the verses in the Torah that deal with hashavat aveda, that deal with the laws of interest, of ribit, that deals with the laws of shomrim, that deals with the shomer chinam, shomer sachar, meaning it's all very textually based, and it connects the Torah Shebichtav and the Torah Shebal Peh. Baba Batra, as first pointed out by Rambam, is almost entirely not biblically based. It's almost entirely based on what we might call logic, svara, minhag hamedina, conventional civil agreements. It's a very different flavor of it. And if, again, let me see if I can pull this up and let me see if I can share. So Maimonides says in his introduction to the Perush HaMishnayot, Ve'achar kach Baba Batra, after the Rambam, towards the end of his introduction to Perush HaMishnayot, he notes the organizational principles of the entire, every Masechet in the Mishnah. He says, Ve'achar kach Baba Batra, Ve'inyano l'daber b'chalukat ha'karkaot. It talks about how you divide land, which is being shared. V'hadinin b'inyan hadirot ha'meshutafot v'shchunot. And when you're talking about shared living quarters, and where you're talking about shchunot, where you're shared neighborhoods and neighbors, upitul mekach umemkar b'mum hanimtza, okay, and blemish found, and all these things. V'heich ra'ui ladun v'ha'arvot v'ha'yerushot. When it comes to arevut, guarantees and inheritance. V'seder ha'chelek hazeh b'achrono b'shvil shekulo kabbalah v'divrei svarot v'lo hitba'er min ha'torah. So Maimonides makes the point that this entire Masechet, except for Yerusha, which does have a few psukim in the Torah, but most of the laws of Yerusha most of the laws of inheritance are almost entirely based on Torah Shebal Peh. So not only Torah Shebal Peh, but Rambam says Kulo Kabbalah, by received tradition, and Divrei Svarot, and they are words based on reasoning. Most of the Masechet is based on reasoning. And I just wanted to highlight that. If you look at the difference in the Rambam's introduction in his Mishnah Torah, his kotarot, his headings, in that which is makbil, that which is parallel, let's say, to some of the prakim in Baba Kama versus some of the prakim in Baba Batra, some of the chapters. So here's an example. If you look in Hilchot Gzeila v'Aveda, where the Rambam introduces the laws of stealing and the laws of returning lost objects, which are major themes in the book, in the Masechet Baba Kama, major themes in Masechet Bava Metzia. Yesh bichlalan sheva mitzvot. There are 7 specific biblical commandments that are being played out in these laws. The chamesh mitzvot lo taseh. There are 2 positives and 5 negatives. Shelo ligzol, shelo la'ashok, shelo lachmod, not to steal, not to oppress, not to covet. Shelo litavot, not to covet and then take and put it into play. La'ashiv et ha'gzeila. Shelo yit'alem min ha'aveda. You shouldn't ignore an aveda. La'ashiv ha'aveda. In contrast, when the Rambam introduces the laws of shchenim, hilchot shchenim, how neighbors who are sharing a space and how they divide that space, and especially the public area around their individual houses, Rambam does not start with yesh bichlalan sheva mitzvot or shtei mitzvot. He calls them inyanim, inyan elu, these things, these issues. Inyan elu, ha'halachot leida din chiluk ha'karkaot bein ha'shutafim, to know how to divide land between people who are sharing area, v'archakat nezek, and to prevent nezek. There's all kinds of takanot in Masechet Baba Batra to prevent damage from occurring in the first place. Baba Kama does not talk about preventing damage. It talks about, given that there is damage, what happens when there's damage? Who pays, how much you pay, what do you do, in what circumstances you pay, all that is the reality. So these are all And just another example, Hilchot Shluchin V'Shutafim, the laws related to agency and the laws related to people who share land, property, etc. Inyan Elu Halachot Leida Din Shlucho Shel Adam V'Shutafo, how to create agency and create partnerships. Umishpatehem B'Mekach Umemkar, how they engage in business. Ubiur kol hadinim ha'elu beprakim ha'elu. Ubiur kol hadinim ha'elu beprakim ha'elu. And the explanation of these laws are going to be in this parak. So for the Rambam, it is very much, and again, I think it's a very important point. For the Rambam, Baba Batra is of a different order than the first two Mesechtot in Mesechet Nezikin, even though they all come under the rubric of Dinei Mamonot, and Misha Rotzeh Lachkim, as the Mishnah at the end of Baba Batra says, anyone who wants to become a scholar should study these in depth. However, it's of a different order, and one could go deeper. Rav Kook, in one of his, we have a transcription of the introduction that he gave to Mesechet Baba Batra in Merkaz Harav, in the yeshiva which he first started in the 20s, and when they learned Baba Batra, so he talked about this theme, and he basically he said that you can look at it from two different perspectives, which was very Rav Kookian. On the one hand, you could say that using the principle that we find sometimes use in halacha, Kol ha-mikudash mechavero kodem lechavero. There's a principle in halacha that anything which is more holy comes first. So on a very plain kind of level, you could say, oh, that's why Baba Kama comes first. Because if you think about it conceptually, it's a little weird. Why would you start the entire laws of civil law talking about damages? First, talk about how you establish ownership. First, talk about mekach umemkar, how you do business, how you establish ownership, how things are a person, how you transfer ownership. Why do you start with mekach? Why do you start with nezek, with damages, which are assuming people already have ownership on something, and you've damaged something that they own. You've hurt them in some way. First establish what we would call, bailus, as we say. So Rambam says,
well, you also learn gittin before you have,
which itself is a fascinating problem and has to be dealt with. But I'm not teaching Masechet Nashim, I'm teaching Nezikin. And so in this context, always you have to ask the logical questions. For example, if you open up the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, this is not the way that he sets up the laws. In the book of Kinyan, he starts with Hilchot Mechira. He starts with the laws of buying and selling. Then he talks about the laws of giving a gift, Zechia Umatana. Then he talks about Hilchot Shchenim. Then he talks about the laws of how do people who own property next to each other, how do they get along to make sure that they're not intruding on each other. Then he talks about the laws of Shluchim V'Shutfin. So that's a logical progression. And in fact, for the Rambam, Baba Kama is all in a different book. It's not even in the book of Kinyan. It's in the book of Nezikin. Nezikin is a totally separate book of the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah. Nezikin has its own category. Nizkei Mamon, damages related to property damage. And then it talks about Gzeila V'Aveda. It talks about stealing from someone, which is a higher level of damage. Then it talks about the highest level of damage, Chovel Umazik, when you hurt someone, when you physically harm another human being, till it reaches the greatest crescendo, which is Hilchot Rotzeach, the laws of murder. That makes perfect sense. The organization of the Rambam in the way that he logically plays out what's going on, but that's not the way the Gemara did. And so Rambam here, I think, was looking and tried to argue that we're moving from that which is biblical in its origin to that which is purely or mostly based upon logic and svara. And I mentioned Rav Kook. I wanted to finish that thought. Rav Kook, so in his introduction to the shiur he gave in the 1920s to Baba Batra, so he writes, or it was, the transcription is, on the one hand, it makes perfect sense. Kol ha-mekudash me-chavero kodem lechavero. So that which is from the Torah directly, meaning it has the most sources in the Torah, should come first. So even though from a higayon point of view, from a logical point of view, maybe the laws of Mechira and the laws in Baba Batra should come before the laws in Baba Kama, since this is rooted in Torah, it comes first. On the other hand, Rav Kook, in his kind of very interesting way, from a more mystical point of view, says, well, there's another principle in Jewish law, which is not kol ha-mekudash mechaver kodem lechaver, that which is holy always comes first. As we all know from Nerot Chanukah, we know that from Nerot Chanukah, ma'alin bakodesh ve'ein moridin. We go up in holiness, not down in holiness, which is a totally different principle. It's not that anything which is holier comes first, and then you go down to lower levels. It's just the opposite. So Rav Kook says, what's the difference between the two principles? When do you apply one principle? When do you apply other principle? So Rav Kook says, very convincingly, the principle of Malin Bakodesh Ve'ein Moridin is when you're talking about one unit. Within one unit, so like Hanukkah, should you start with 8 days, 8 candles, and go down to 1 candle, like Beit Shammai, or should you go from 1 candle up to 8 candles? But we're talking about one mitzvah. We're talking about one unit. We're talking about one specific act, but one specific holiday together. So then you apply the principle of Ma'alin Bakodesh Ve'ein Moridin. You go up rather than down. When it comes to things which are not directly connected, for example, the Gemara has a discussion which korban comes first, the ola, the chatas, whatever. They're all korbanot, but they're different. They're totally different korbanot. They're totally different sacrifices. And so they're the principle of kol ha-mekudash mechavero. Anything which is considered more holy than the other one comes first. So that's Rav Kook. So now, when it comes, again, to Baba Kama, Baba Basra, so the first thing he says, as I mentioned, is one way to understand it is because it's holier, because it comes directly from Kitvei HaKodesh. It comes directly from Scripture. Baba Kama comes first, and then we go to the things which don't have direct. Most of Baba Batra doesn't have direct connection. It's mostly based on logic and convention. On the other hand, he then flips the tables and he says, but maybe just the opposite. Maybe one can theoretically, if in fact Masechet Nezikin is to be seen as one large unit, maybe there's something profound, the mirror image, certainly on a mystical level, that maybe we're going Malin Bakodesh Ve'ein Moridin. That on some mystical level, what God tells us directly is holy, but if we can get to the place where human beings, human rationality is in its very existence expressing, bringing out forth what God's will is in the world, that maybe that's a higher level. And so that's a kind of very Rav Kookian read of this Rambam in terms of that. So it's kind of two mirror images of how you take it. Okay, let's now continue. And continuing our introduction, while Baba Batra, as I said, is different than the other, while it's different than the rest of Nezikin, but it also is clearly organized to be connected to the previous end of the last book. So again, just to show you, we note a very interesting thing. If you For those of you, again, I don't know if you have the Mishnah in front of you, if you have a whole Mishnah in front of you, but let me point out, if you look at the end of let me see if I can open this for a second. Let me stop. It's here. Safrai, in his Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, which is a wonderful book, points out the last chapter of Bava Metzia, which is chapter 10, starts with the question of shutfin, meaning the idea, Bava Metzia, most of it, as I said, was not talking about anything related to Bava Basra. But the last chapter begins to touch on some of the same topics, which will then, or slightly connected to topics and language, that will then be developed in Bava Batra. So, for example, in the 10th chapter of Bava Metzia, it starts with Habayit v'haliyah shel shnayim. If there's a house and there's an attic that is owned, that is of two people. But here, we're talking about schirut, we're talking about renter. There's a renter on top, and there's the balabayit on the bottom. He rents out his attic. Shenaflu, shneim cholkim be'etzim uba'avanim uba'afar. They both divide or maybe not just the renter, someone who bought it. They divide what happened. So here we're talking about a situation of that. On the Bava Batra, Perek Aleph begins with a similar theme. Shutafim shiratzu la'asot mechitza b'chatzer bonin et hakotel ba'emtza. So you have again something similar. Two shutafim, two partners. And we'll get to what it means when we look at the Mishnah itself. Two partners shiratzu la'asot mechitza b'chatzer bonin et hakotel ba'emtza. Lefikach im nafal hakotel hamakom v'avanim shel shneim. Again, the same language. Lefikach im nafal hakotel. Here too, shenaflu hamakom v'avanim. They're divide, cholkin. There are both of theirs. And the same thing, it then goes on to give an example with a beit abad and a gina, a garden. And so too here, in the beginning of Bava Batra, it gives a garden and a gina. So I want to put a different, okay, so there's a connection, and this was noted again by the Rishonim, the Meiri, Beit HaBechira from Provence, Ha'inyan Shmini, the 8th issue, B'inyanei Misha Habayit le'echad v'aliyah shel acher. If the house was owned by one and the attic was owned by another, she'ira machloket ben shnehem. V'hu mimin ha'masechet ha'shlishit. And this is already similar to the topic that will then show up in the 3rd Masechet, what we call Bava Batra. Ad she'amru alav shaya ra'ui lekololo ma'masechet ha'shlishit. This actually should have been part of Bava Metzia. Ela shenitgalgel bezu mipnei shenitgalgel minyanei sachar sachir. It just happened to be at the end of Bava Metzia. And Tosfot says the same thing, that the language is in order to connect it. And I wanted to show you how far this goes, to the point where if you look in the Tosefta, okay, just to make it clear, here, look at, just want to make myself very clear. Bava Batra begins discussing shutafin, discusses the laws related to shutafin. And we'll go into some of the mishnayot in a few minutes, exactly what it means or what it doesn't mean, as you've been reading it. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 talks about not imposing on other people because it might harm another person. So notice here, all the language in the second chapter, which we'll go into more depth next week. Lo yachpor, you shouldn't, dig. Adam bor samuch leboro shel chaviro, very close to the bore of his friend. You shouldn't dig a ditch right near. You shouldn't do all these things because they can undermine it, and you have to make sure that it's away at least a couple of tfachim, a number of feet. Marchikin.
They'll impact.
Right, because
on
you're going to
each
have an
other.
impact. This is what's called in halacha harchakat nizakim, meaning we're not dealing with post facto like Baba Kama. This and this ate my field. This animal, this car ran into my car. How much do you have to pay? When do you have to pay? That's all post facto. All of Baba Kama is about post facto. Here, the second chapter is talking about harchakat. What do you, living together as shchenim, have to do? In contrast, this is all about taking proactive action. Lo yachpor, you shouldn't dig. Lo ya'amid adam tanur b'toch habayit, you shouldn't put it in the house if it's going to impact on other people. Lo yiftach adam chanut, you shouldn't open your bakery if it's going to do this and this and this. All these are things about marchikim. Put them away. Make sure that there's an ample space between what you're doing and your fellow neighbor. That's what chapter 2 starts with. Chapter 1 is talking about shutafim. It's talking about, again, partners and neighbors. So that's the connective tissue. It's all talking about what happens with neighbors and your responsibility, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. But if you look carefully, this is already about harchakat nizakim. Now, what's fascinating is this is not the only way that it had to be divided. Meaning, the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, chose, even though the end of Bava Metzia already started talking about Habayit va'aliyah shel shnehem, a house and an aliyah of and an attic of two. Shenaflu, what do you do if they fall? What do you do with the contents? Who gets? Can you determine? Is there a way to determine how much of the beams and the rocks is from the roof, and how much is there a way to determine? How do you divide it, etc., etc.? Shneim cholkin. The same here. We're talking not anymore about two separate parties, but it's still related. Shutafin, two neighbors. Shiratzu lasot mechitza bechatzer, bonin et hakotel ba'emtza. Lefikach im nafal hakotel, if the kotel fell, hamakom v'amanim shel shneim. And then it continues dealing with all these kind of chapters, all these kinds of questions. Im nafal hakotel, etc., etc. Kotel hechatzer shenafal mechayvin. You have to, you obligate each one of the neighbors to build it. Ad arba amot. It has to be at least arba amot when you rebuild it. And then there are certain things. It's not just mechayvin, but kofin. You force certain things to be done by those who all live together under one roof. That's very nice. But notice for a second, and the way the Tosefta, which is the parallel to the Mishnah, if I pull it up and then I share it. So if I pull it up, because I didn't put this on, the Tosefta of Bava Metzia, and then the Tosefta of Baba Batra. So first I'll do the Tosefta of Bava Metzia. So if you look at the Tosefta of Bava Metzia, so now, and let me share it, you'll notice the parallel to the Mishnah. It doesn't have 10 chapters like Baba Kama. Bava Metzia, Baba Kama, they have 11 chapters. Not 10, 11. It starts with Habayit va'aliyah shel shnaim shenaflu. Shneim cholkim be'etzim ba'avanim. Exactly like the Mishnah starts in the 10th chapter of Bava Metzia. And it continues in this. And in the middle, it quotes a number of the mishnayot that appear in the first chapter of Baba Batra. And so it will talk about certain instances of kofin. Mishesh lo petach b'mavoi, ein b'nei mavoi kofin oto. They're not able to force them. But in certain instances, they are. Kofin b'nei, many of the cases that appear in the first chapter of Baba Batra. In contrast, if you look at the Tosefta, keep going. You look, sorry, where did it stop? I don't know why it stopped. Go faster. So if I go back to the Tosefta, and this time I go to the Tosefta of Baba Batra, look at how the first chapter of the Tosefta of Baba Batra starts. The Tosefta of Baba Batra, chapter 1 starts, Lo yachpor adam bor samuch leboro shel chaveiro. You're not supposed to dig a hole. Baba Batra, Perek Aleph in the Tosefta, is Baba Batra, Perek Bet in the Mishnah. So in organizational terms, you could have put the first chapter at the end of Baba Batra, already at the end of Bava Metzia. And it didn't do that. The Mishnah chose to make this what we call lo yachpor, marchikin. You put away the nezikin, you set aside you make sure that the damages don't happen a priori as the second chapter. And the first chapter is really, so to speak, half or part of what we call the 11th chapter in the Tosefta. Why? Again, probably because of symmetry, because you wanted to make sure that there were 10 chapters, 10 chapters, and 10 chapters. So the Mishnah was organized not just, or not only specifically content-wise, but also from a literary point of view, from an organizational point of view, from a remembering point of view, whatever term you want to use, to make sure that you had 10, 10, and 10, even though you could have, as the Tosefta indicates, you could have had the parts of the first chapter stuck back in Bava Metzia, as the Meiri notes, without noting the Tosefta, that they're really part of the last chapter. Okay, now I want to actually look at this first chapter of Baba Batra and
Can I
make...
ask you a question?
Sure.
Is there any other, excuse my ignorance, but is there no, I really know nothing about Mishnayos except up to here where I've learned from Mishnah Yomit. But is there any other section that has also 30 and is divided 10, 10, and 10?
Yes. Towards the end of Shas, towards the end of the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, you have Kalim, Masechet Kalim, which is also divided 10, 10, and 10 in this way. And also people ask this question about how it's organized and stuff like that. Okay, let's take a few, the last moments that we have with us together. I want to take a look at the, let me go back to our first chapter and say a couple of things about the first chapter itself. Again, I don't follow personally the Mishnah Yomit schedule, so I don't know exactly which Mishnah you're up to in the first chapter. What are they up to today in the first chapter?
We're in Perek Bet.
You already started Perek Bet. Okay, so today we're going to only be able to comment on Perek Aleph, and next week I'll do some Perek Bet and Perek Gimel as well. So first of all, let me get back my sheets. And so I want to, so I'll share. Okay, so as you see on the screen, Baba Batra Perek Aleph, it's organized in, once again, it's organized again, just to make that point, it's organized literarily in a way that moves, so to speak, it moves in intensity in terms of cases, and then at the end comes back to, so to speak, the original case or the language. So it starts with shutafim shiratzu la'asot mechitza bechatzer. Shutafim, partners, but it's not partners in the legal sense like, oh, I have a partner in business. It actually is a reference to neighbors, as opposed to, and that's another reason, again, I said, Bava Metzia Perek Yud talks about two people who are together in the sense that one owns the attic and the other one owns the house. But they're not partners in the sense of, oh, they came together. And they're not neighbors in the sense of, they are neighbors, but they're not neighbors in the sense of each having their own, house and living next to each other. They're sharing this shared space that one bought this, one bought that. These guys are neighbors next to each other. Shutafim shiratzu la'asot mechitza bechatzer. Again, taking the Mishnah kipshuta, without going into the way the Gemara interpreted it, the Mishnah seems to be talking about optional. If they choose to put up a barrier because they want to demarcate their territory more carefully, they're allowed to. Bonin et hakotel be'emtza. If they agree to do that, they should build, down the middle. And when they build this, each one of them has to contribute to a little bit of their space to the wall. So if the wall is 5 feet thick, each one of them has to give 2.5 things. Hakol keminhag hamedina, following whatever is the custom, the convention in that society. And then the Mishnah goes into details, about different types of material, different types of walls, how much do you have to give, etc. Lefikach, because they agreed to this and they do it together, im nafal hakotel hamakom v'avanim shel shneim. If this wall at some point falls, the space and the rocks are both of theirs because they each gave an equal amount of money, space to build it. The same thing in a gina. But notice here, we have a new language. Here it's ratzu. It's all about ratzon. It's all about if you want to. It's very optional. The second stage, when it talks about a gina, when it talks about sharing the space of a gina, mechayvin oto. Okay? Here, there's a chiyuv. There's an obligation. So we've moved up a notch in terms of you don't obligate him. Ella im ratzah. Again, only if there's willingness. And again, another case, hamakif et chavero mishalosh ruchotav. If your area surrounds another person's, if your farm, let's say, surrounds another person's from 3 sides, so he's protected from 3 sides by your fences, there's no obligation to build a 4th fence. But if he did build a 4th fence, if the person being surrounded did choose to build a 4th fence, so that shows that he really wants all the 4 directions now to close off his territory. Then he is obligated. And again, everything here is about obligation. Obligation, obligation, obligation. Finally, we get to the final cases. Kofino to livnot bayit shar v'delet lechatzer. Here we're not talking anymore about shared space within the space. Here we're talking about space, the space that you share in terms of its relationship to the outside world. Remember in the rabbis' times, there were houses that were built next to each other. There was a chatzer, there was a courtyard, which was a shared space where they cooked, where they did cleaning, where they did all these things. And then the chatzer went out into the Reshut HaRabim, it opened up into, so here, kofin, it's not just an obligation, you can actually use coercive power. Kofin, 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 kofin. And then at the end, it comes back to where it started. Ein cholkin et hachatzer. It kind of finishes up. It doesn't tell you over there. It talks about shnutfim shiratzu lasot mechitza b'chatzer. The last Mishnah in this parak kind of gives us a little bit of detail of it has to be a certain significant space. Ein cholkin et hachatzer ad shiu bat arba amot lazev arba. Has to be a minimum amount of space to each one. 4 amot to each one. But it ends and it says, regarding all these criterion, ematai bisman she'ein shnehem rotzin. Aval bisman she'shnehem rotzin. We close. It's a literary envelope. We close the way we began the parak. But bisman she'shnehem rotzim. At the time when both of them agree, even if the area is smaller than arba amot by arba amot, yachloku, they can divide it. They divide the territory, and that's considered okay. The Kitvei HaKodesh, af al pi sheshnehem rotzim. When it comes to a bundle of scripture, you cannot split it, even if you want it. So it started with rotzim, cases of what you want to do, optional. It talked about cases of obligation. It talked about cases of coercion, and it ended off once again explaining the rotzin situations and what you can and what you can't. Now, I want to focus for a second on the first Mishnah in terms of pshat. The pshat of the Mishnah versus the way the Talmud chooses to interpret the Mishnah. Shutafin shiratzu la'asot mechitza bechatzer. If shutafin that want to make a mechitza bechatzer, they want to make a division in the chatzer. If you look at the Mishnah with kind of open eyes, there's no statement here that there's an obligation for them to do this. It's simply a choice. What's also interesting is that the Mishnah doesn't tell us why they want to do this. Why do they want to split up the chatzer that until now they've kind of shared all of the space kind of co-equally, and they haven't really made a clear demarcation. This is your part of the chatzer, and this is my part of the chatzer. We've kind of, like good neighbors, sometimes good neighbors, they kind of, they're kids. They play on everybody's field and everybody's fence and etc. So why? The text doesn't say why. And if you asked me a question, I would say they decide to build a fence. For whatever reason, they decide to build a fence. They don't want the dogs coming across. They want to make sure that everybody knows whose property. So if they have to deliver the mail, the text is very ambiguous. It doesn't give a rationale why it is this way. And if you just had this Mishnah, and I don't see in this Mishnah any obligation to build a fence. This Mishnah is all saying if they choose to build a fence, they should build it in the middle, and each one of them should give whatever the custom is. They should follow the custom, and that's it. And lefikach im nafal hakotel hamakom bavanim shel shneim, which is perfectly logical, makes sense, plays off of the end of Bava Metzia. Now, at the end of the parak, at the end of the chapter, it then seems to be limiting when it wants to go back to the first case, to close the circle. It says, Ad sheba arba amot lezev arba amot lezev, that you don't divide it unless it has arba amot lezev. Generally, you don't divide it unless it has this amount of space and that amount of space and this amount of space. Generally, you shouldn't do it. But the Mishnah says, Bisman, this is all when you're dealing with Bisman she'ein shnehem rotzim, when both of them can't come to an agreement. Aval Bisman she'shnehem rotzim, when it comes to an agreement, afilu pachot mikain, then even less than this area they can divide. So this Mishnah, this caveat, raises all kinds of interesting questions because, and I think that's what drove the Talmud to say, okay, so it says here, Shutfin Shiratzu, that neighbors that want to divide the space of the Chatzer, this is the way that they should build the wall between them. These are the guidelines. Hakol Keminhag HaMedina, follow what is the general, and it gives you the general guidelines of what is going. But then this end seems to say, Ein Cholkin et HaChatzer ad shehei ba'arba amot lazeh, ba'arba amot lazeh. It has to have a minimum amount of space. So is this kind of the rabbis imposing, a caveat to what they're doing in terms of that it can't be done unless this, and the implication would be that is the implication, therefore, when the last line, when it says Eimatai, when is this? Bisman she'ein shneim rotzin, when they don't both want it. Al bisman she'shneim rotzin, afil pachot mikein yachloku. So is that to imply that there is some area here that they have to divide the chatzer when it's at least arba amot by arba amot? There is an obligation. Is that the way to read the Mishnah together? Or meaning, in a time when they want, bisman sheshnehem rotzin, afilu pachot mikein. Even if there's no minimum, they can do whatever they want. They're allowed to split. But these rules of ein cholkin et chatzer is bisman sheshnehem, ein shnehem rotzin. Then it has to be at minimum when they're not agreeing. So does that imply that when they're not agreeing, they have to split it anyway? Is that what it's implying? Right? You understand my question? And I think the Talmud saw that, because theoretically you could also just say, don't take it so literally. All the Talmud is doing is just using a kind of literary cliche. Bisman sheshneim rotzin, when they agree, they can do whatever they want. The phrase bisman she'ein shneim rotzin shouldn't be taken so literally to imply, that even when you don't agree, you are forced to divide the middle. I think you could just read it as, in general, this is the way you divide. But in general, this is the way you divide. But if you want to go even smaller than that, you can do whatever you want. But the Talmud, I don't think, read it that way. And the Talmud ends up reading this line in the Mishnah as an obligation that you must split. You must split the place. And this Mishnah is only talking about a case where it's even smaller than the normal arba amot by arba amot. That's when we talk about rotzin. But if it's not rotzin, then if it's big enough, you're obligated to do it, which introduces the Talmud here, the concept of what we call hezek re'iyah. The Talmud interprets this Mishnah as referring to a situation that you must put up a fence, not of some abstract reason, which I said could be a million different reasons, but because of what's called the damages of sight. What's the damages of sight? The damages of sight are you need to ensure that people have privacy. That you need to ensure that people have privacy, that they are not looked on. And this is what this Mishnah is driving at. Now, again, if you look carefully at the Mishnah, it doesn't say anything like that. The Mishnah will say it much later on in the 6th chapter. Does this include the 6th chapter? No, but I'll get you the 6th chapter. Lo yiftach adam chalonotav lechatzar hashutafin. You should not open a window into the chatzer of shutafin. And you're not supposed to do that. Lakach bayit bechatzer acheret, lo yiftechenu lechatzer hashutafin. Shouldn't open a window. Bana al gabe lo yiftechenu lechatzer hashutafin. Ela im ratza bonet hacheder lifanim mi beito. So here, the Mishnah makes it very clear that you have this principle that you shouldn't be opening windows into where you see from your house, you can see certain things. That's explicit. It's not at all clear in the Mishnah in Perek Aleph that there is anything related to that question. But the Talmud decides to connect it, and those of you who will learn in the Gemara, will see that the Talmud brings that in terms of here. Now, why was the Talmud driven? Again, I tried to explain a little bit, but there may be other things going on. Okay. Im Yirtzeh Hashem, next week, we will go into chapter 2 and chapter 3, and we'll try to unpack some of the structure of the Mishnah. That's what I'm generally going to try to do every week. We'll try to deal with structure, literary patterns, and meaning on a pshat level of some of the mishnayot, as well as maybe some of the values that emerge as we read these mishnayot. I would just close with, again, I'll develop that next week, Emir Tzah Hashem. Okay.
Being here. See you next week. And also, please, this is just one of our many exciting new fall classes. So please go to drisha.org/classes to see those. We have a really great lineup. So looking forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.